In this installment of Professor Brillinger's anatomy class, we're going to be going over chapter 8, which is joints. And to start, we have 6 different kinds of joints. And we're going to have 3 different kinds of functional and 3 different structural kinds. The 3 functional ones, we're going to have synarthrosis joints, which are joints that do not move whatsoever. And where you can find that kind of joint is, say, sutures in the skull, which form your skull. Got sutures. Or another example is like gomphosis, which are your teeth. Next on the list for functionals, we're going to have amphiarthrosis joints, which are joints that just move just a little bit. And in the final joint for the functional category, we're going to have the diarthrosis joint, which you can find pretty much the majority of the joints in your body, you know, your elbows, your shoulders, your hips, all that good stuff. And now we're going to move on to the 3 structural types of joints. And to start, we're going to have the fibrous joint. Now this is a joint that is held together mostly by connective tissue, and it is found only in the skull. So this joint is what connects like sutures together and what keeps the gomphosis joint, your teeth, locked in. So next on the list for 3 structural joints, we're going to have the cartilaginous joint, which is a joint that is entirely made up of cartilage. And some examples of the cartilaginous joint is the synchondrosis joint. Here, or this joint, you will find, say, your sternum or your epiphyseal plate. That's right, sternum. And the other one is going to be the syndesmosis joint. And this is where you'll find the cartilage in between your intervertebral discs or your pubis. Next up on the list, we're going to have the synovial joint. And think of this as a joint that you have to think and move. So it ties in nicely with the diarthrosis joint. So it's pretty much every joint that moves very freely. And a nice acronym to help remember all of these is we've got S for synarthrosis, A for amphiarthrosis, D for diarthrosis, which makes sad. We've got F for fibrous joints, C for cartilaginous joints, and S for synovial, which means sad faces. Next up, we're going to talk about the general structures of the knee. So right here, my lovely assistant drew a knee. And first on the list, we're going to talk about articular cartilage. And that is going to be found about right in here, right between the 2 bones. And so what articular cartilage does is it's going to absorb compression during any day activities like walking, for instance. So next, which encases the joint entirely, is going to be located right around here, and that's going to be the articular capsule. And the articular capsule is going to be made entirely of dense, irregular connective tissue. It's going to be 2 layers thick, DICT for short. And then, next on the list, and final, we have the synovial cavity, which is going to be these little things right here. And so what that does is that holds synovial fluid inside the joint that helps with abrasion. Alright, so next up on the video we're going to talk about the knee joint, which is one of the weaker joints in the body. And we're going to look at the knee, which we have an anterior view of. And it's going to be your right knee, so this is the medial line. And for starters, we're going to have a ligament right here. Come around this way, and that is going to be the fibular collateral ligament, also known as the LCL, which is usually what they call it. And then coming around this way right here is going to be probably the most important, which is going to be the ACL. And you see that injury a lot of times in sports, and that's usually the most devastating to an athlete. Next up on the medial side is we're going to have the tibial cruciate ligament, or also known as the MCL, the medial cruciate ligament. And then just behind the ACL, right here, this is going to be the posterior ligament that just helps support the ACL. Alright, so to finish off this section of the ligaments and tendons of the knee, we're going to talk about right at the top of the tibia is where you'll find the lateral meniscus. And just next to him, we're going to have his partner in crime, which is going to be the medial meniscus. And they sort of bring everything together.
In this section of the chapter, we're going to be talking about joint movements. The first movement is gliding joints. These only glide, and these are found in your metacarpals and your metatarsals. These glide right past each other on short bones. All right, angular movements are produced by changing the angle of the joints. The first one is flexion. Extension. And something you don't want to do, hyperextend. All right, so flexion is when you decrease the angle at the joint. The next one is extension, which increases the angle at the joint. And hyperextension would be this arm going past the angle, which would be devastating and most likely a sports injury. The next one we have is dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. All right, the movements for dorsiflexion are when your heels are down and your toes up, flexing your calf. The next one is plantar flexion, when you put your toes down and your heel up. This is also flexing the calf. The next one is adduction and abduction. Adduction is when you start from here and you're adding it to your body, moving it towards the midline of your body. The next one is abduction, when you're moving it away, laterally away from the midline. The next one is circumduction. All right, circumduction movement would be the movement all together, which would be like this, or whatever movement you like.
Yeah, cowboy.
Yeah. Next, we're going to talk about rotations. Rotation can happen at the cervical area. This will be rotating right 80 degrees or left 80 degrees. The next, we can talk about rotation medially rotating and laterally rotating. This could happen at the hip, where you turn your foot out laterally your whole foot, your whole legs facing the other side. And then medially is towards the midline right here. Turn your hip right here. And that'll do it. Welcome back. Next we're going to talk about special movements. And the first one is going to be pronation and supination. These movements can happen at the forearm. Palm of the hand is the point where you want to concentrate on. Pronating is when you have your palm of your hand facing down. This is when the radius is completely over the ulna. The next one is supination, when you have your palm of your hand facing upwards. The radius and ulna are completely parallel. The next one we have is inversion and eversion. This can happen at the foot. Inversion is turning it towards the midline right here. Eversion is turning it out away from the midline. All right, next on our list is protraction and retraction. This can happen at the jaw. Protraction would be moving your jaw out. Retraction would be putting it back. Not really good with it. Next one is elevation and depression. An example will be me walking in to see Endgame. Probably like this.
Hype.
Elevation. And then walking out of Endgame, depression right here. The next one we have is opposition and reposition. This mainly happens at the thumb. Opposition, and then reposition. Opposition, reposition. Next one we have is lateral flexion. This would be if you're working out and you're holding a dumbbell right here, laterally going the other way, away from the midline. All right, next we're going to talk about 6 structural types of synovial joints. First one we have plane, which has no axis and happens on short bones, which is found in your wrist. Next one we have is hinge joints. This happens at the elbow and is like a door, and it happens at the knee. Just has one axis going that way. Next one we have is the pivot. Next one we have is pivot. This could happen as rotating the radius over the ulna in the forearm. The next one up is the condyloid joint. This one has 2 axes and moves your fingers. The next one we have is the saddle joint. This joint is found in the thumb and moves it around. Next one and the last one we have is the ball and socket. This one is multi-axis and is in the shoulder. The shoulder, you think of the shoulder bone as a ball and connected to the joint capsule, and it moves around in there. That'll
Yeehaw.
do it. The next section we're going to talk about is homeostatic imbalances of the joints. First one we have are sprains. These commonly happen in the wrist and the ankle. It happens in the ankle when you roll your ankle off stepping off stairs, or when you're playing football or basketball and you break someone's ankles. Next one we have is wrist. Happens when you hyperextend it this way and it sprains the link. The next one we're talking about is cartilage damage. These injuries are tough because they don't normally heal themselves and can lead to osteoarthritis. Alright, the next we have is dislocations. This happens when the joint is popped out of its normal area and from the joint capsule. This normally happens in the shoulder. Or if you're Bo Jackson, happens in the hip.
Great athlete.
The next one we have is a subluxation. This falls under the dislocation category because this is what happens when the bone pops out of its joint capsule but comes back in. This makes it easier for it to dislocate a second time on little movements such as picking up your arm. Alright, the next section we're going to talk about is inflammatory and degenerative conditions. The first one we have is the bursitis, spelled like this.